Hi there, my name is Philip Ideson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. Today on the podcast, we dig into the construction category, which I think is the first time we've ever talked about construction on Art of Procurement. And joining me to take me on that journey through the peculiarities of construction procurement, different project methodologies and tips on how to play a strategic role supporting major construction projects is Neha Kumar. Neha has experience working for companies like Barclays, Bloomberg, Deutsche Bank, and Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation across corporate services, facilities, and real estate categories with a recent focus on construction. So let's go into the conversation where I start by asking Neha if she found procurement or if procurement found her.
Procurement definitely found me. I graduated from college thinking that I would go into the world of investment banking. And that was during the tech boom of the early 2000s.
Yeah.
And I quickly found myself actually going into procurement. Started off in direct procurement and moved quickly into indirect procurement.
So I know that you've got a lot of background in real estate, facility services, and construction procurement. That's actually, construction is really what we're going to focus on today. But how did you find yourself or end up in those kind of categories?
Well, I actually feel like it depends on where the market is going. Mid-career, I found myself working for a financial services company, helping them with their real estate portfolio, kind of on their mortgage capital side, where I was supporting them with their sourcing initiatives for appraisals, specialized mortgage products. And as was the case in 2008, some of those financial companies did go bust. I found myself being a part of an acquisition where they kind of looked at my resume and said, well, you've been supporting real estate, so why don't you just come on board and do corporate real estate services procurement for us? And that's how I found myself first supporting facilities management. And as that world changed to become more of a supplier rationalization project, moved over to construction.
Right. So let's talk about, I want to talk about construction procurement specifically. It's really interesting because we're just past episode 600 on the Art of Procurement. I don't think we've ever talked about construction procurement. So I'm actually interested in today's conversation. It's going to help educate me as well on this because it's not a category that I know a ton about. So what are some of the kind of common models for construction sourcing?
There are two or three, right? There's the general contractor model where you just give everything to a general contractor and they go ahead and do what they need to do, right? Then there is what I like to call construction management, which is where the entire team that's involved in a project is intimately involved from the beginning stages. And then there's also the design, bid, build, where there is a designer, then you go out to bid, and then you build. Each one of them have their pros and cons. I personally have one or two of my own favorites, but we can dive into details from there for sure.
Yeah, I'd love to know is procurement involvement usually limited to one or two of those kind of models, or where procurement is involved in construction, do we get involved in all three of those models?
We do get involved in all three. And honestly, it all depends on our collaboration with our real estate clients, right? When they decide to actually get us engaged. And that's when we can play the biggest impact. I often say that the construction management methodology works best because you're not only getting procurement involved in the very beginning, you're also getting some of your consultants that are going to support you throughout the project involved in the beginning. So what I mean by that is if we have a contractor that's going to do the actual build out involved from the beginning stages, they're working with the architects, the engineers, everyone involved in the design to come up with the best design possible so that we stick to the schedules and the expenses involved with that project.
And so this may be, I don't know if it's a basic question or a stupid question, but who are the stakeholders as a construction procurement expert? Who are you mostly interacting with? Who are you there to ultimately support and deliver for?
I would say it is most definitely the corporate real estate team, or just in any other organization, because commercial real estate, corporate real estate is kind of at a low point right now. But any real estate professional that is actually intimately involved in getting a piece of property up and running.
And are there any particular? Yeah, I think every stakeholder. If we as procurement go in and just try and use a standard procurement playbook, it fails with different stakeholders for different reasons. For marketing, for example, it's not necessarily about saving money; it's about how can you help their budget go further. So I wonder if there's any peculiarities or things that are specific to the way that you build a relationship with a construction stakeholder that may be different from kind of the typical procurement playbook.
Sure. Within procurement, a lot of times people say that procurement is the bottleneck, right? That we take too much time in making a decision or getting an RFP out the door. Our stakeholders are truly, truly looking for that partnership and that understanding that the schedule is just as important as the price, right? So we need to get intimately involved with those stakeholders to understand what is the driving force behind that schedule. Is it that we're going to be moving out of a space and we would have to extend out the lease? Or is it that time is money and we need to start building revenue as quickly as possible, but we need a brick and mortar place to go to?
Yeah. So keeping the schedule is what I just wrote here. Schedule's as important as the price. So that's really the one that they want to focus on, is time as much as the financial side.
Correct. They don't want to hear about delays, and they definitely don't want the vendor selection process to be that delay.
Interesting. Yeah. So a quick process as well is as important as anything. So you talked about different models, the common models. You kind of intimated that you have some thoughts on which are the most appropriate, or perhaps which drive the best results versus another model if you're trying to influence a stakeholder on approaches that they may take. I just wonder if you could share kind of some of your thoughts about those different models and your experiences in using them.
Sure. We'll talk about construction management. That's the model that I tend to use the most, and my stakeholders tend to appreciate that model the most too, right? And that's where we're working together in the beginning stages of a project, right? The stakeholders and I are talking about which consultants do we need to engage, and you're going through a bid process for those consultants themselves, right? Because those consultants are the ones that are helping us design a space, right? And how we're going to live in that space, manage that space going forward. Often enough, when we're thinking about those initial stages of consultants, the actual contractor, the one that's going to be doing the work, is not someone that we think about engaging that early. But within the construction management model, we want them there that early because they have insights into the marketplace that sometimes the designers don't even have insights to, right? So especially in this day and age where we're talking about supply chain management, right? We want to know where those bottlenecks are. Maybe it doesn't make sense to put a particular product that is produced somewhere in the world where there is political upheaval, or, in the world of COVID, that was going up, right? So we want them involved intimately at the beginning. That also helps in coordination of efforts, because then they could think about which subcontractors they need to bring on and when. because it's all about that schedule. It's all about that supply chain that's going to drive the best price, the implementation, delivering on time, and just overall good, solid project being delivered to the end client.
So by doing that allows you're able to design with cost in mind, as opposed to you having a design and now you're having to go and source all the material, or the contractor is going to go and source based on the spec, but you may have either overspec things or spec things that are difficult to get hold of. And so that's the way to kind of get around that.
Right. It's basically giving the contractor the opportunity to value engineer the designs themselves and be a part of that conversation.
Now, as I said at the beginning, I'm a little bit of a newbie to this category. So I just wonder if you could share a little bit about the design build projects and what that model kind of looks like.
Design build, it's pretty much where you're not as intimately involved in the beginning stages of it, right? You have the designers, they come up with the design, and then we go through the process of submitting that design through an RFP to the general contractor, and they go out and provide us with a proposal, right? We're not getting as involved in saying which subcontractors we would recommend using in a particular market or for a particular project. You're not as involved in thinking about whether a contractor is giving you their A team or their B team. But what it does do is it, gets that design out there and the build happening as quickly as possible, because you're just outsourcing it all to one person.
Yeah, you're kind of managing a couple of outsourced relationships as opposed to being heavily involved in every single step of the process.
Exactly.
Which I can see is easier from a resource perspective. If it's I don't have the resources to manage more than that, but then you're not as involved in the actual process.
Right.
As I think about kind of the procurement's role in a construction project, how do we get involved? So we've gone through the sourcing process to, there's a design, there's the contractors that are in place, whether it's a single general contractor or whether it's multiple contractors doing different parts of the build out. What does procurement do on an ongoing basis typically then to support kind of the project management of the build as it's happening?
Honestly, from there, it's more of a governance, right? Where we are making sure the right POs are going out, the change orders are in compliance with the guidelines that we had set in the contract, that if there are issues with the project, we're obliging by the KPIs that we've negotiated. So it really does become more of a governance. We kind of bring those vendors on board. We're negotiating those contracts. Then we leave it to our real estate folks to do what they really are there to do, which is manage the project. However, we're there whenever we need to actually bring up any issues.
Kind of support them with any like problems or performance management issues, for example.
Right.
How well do the suppliers in this space typically engage with procurement? Do they see procurement as being a partner, or are they see us as being more of you said, kind of a roadblock or something that gets in the way when it comes to, some of those reviews and the performance management and things like that?
They definitely look at us as a roadblock for sure. Because honestly, they look at us as, okay, how are you going to make us sharpen our pencils even more? And why, right? They don't want to answer that question. So that's what we kind of have to force them into answering. Most of the time, I'll be honest with you, a lot of our stakeholders know exactly what they're doing, so they can kind of pretty much work it through. Suppliers know that if procurement has entered the picture, that there is a big issue that they need to solve for.
Right. As I'm thinking about kind of the process, and I'm going back a little bit, I know, to sourcing process, and I guess I'm thinking more generally about cost management.
Mhm.
I imagine that this is a space where it's really easy for a contractor, for example, to stipulate one specific price and then that get completely out of control when it comes to the build phase. And, the reality is that maybe there's changes to the design, maybe there's, oh, well, now the cost has increased by 20%, of whatever material, of the steel or of the concrete, since we proposed initially, and trying to claw that back. Like, is there a lot of backwards and forwards from a price perspective on actually delivering against the budget, or what they proposed in RFP? Or do you find that the way that you structure the RFP, if it's done in a good way, actually negates some of that?
It's structuring the RFP and the contract that
Yeah.
negates a lot of that,
Okay.
right? It's more of because the RFP and the contract really stipulates how the purchasing is going to happen, right?
Mhm.
Because a lot of times we're selecting these suppliers before the design is even ready. So
Yeah.
we're putting those guidelines in place from the beginning. We all know that there are going to be change orders. We all know that given the times that we live in, that pricing will fluctuate. So that's why focusing on the schedule and the how to purchase in the beginning stages doesn't completely eliminate that stuff from happening, but it does give everyone the guidelines of how we're going to get over those humps,
Yeah.
especially with price increases and scheduling. It's becoming a lot more and more important to engage contractors that have embraced technology,
Yeah.
right? How great are their bid proposal systems, their project management tools to make sure that they got the right scheduling going on, making sure that we don't have trades that are overlapping, so that you don't have some trades like the electrician sitting there while someone else is working on something and they can't do anything that
Yeah.
day, right? So it's becoming a lot more important to ask those kind of questions during the RFP phase, and making sure that makes it into the contract, so that we know that the suppliers are working alongside the proposals that they submitted.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that the suppliers will then work, if there are cost overruns, that they work with you on mitigating those, or they don't really care, they just see it as a bit of a pass-through back to you?
It really depends on the maturity of the supplier. The more mature suppliers are definitely doing that, while the ones that are kind of, just entering the business or very accustomed to working in a specific local market,
Mm-hmm.
they're not. Are they getting there? 100%, because they're starting to feel that pressure, considering that a lot of resources have left the construction industry in
Mm-hmm.
recent times, right? We were going through a big boom after about 2010 to 2020, and now that's also kind of dried out a bit.
That's interesting. So what's the current state of the market then, in terms of, I think, I don't really like to talk about power dynamics so much, but at the end of the day, that does drive a lot of, the opportunity that procurement has. So are we seeing that there's a lot more leverage on the buying side because of what is really happening to corporate real estate at the moment? There's less projects going on, so it does give you the opportunity to be a bit more selective on who you choose.
Yes, in short answer. Uh, the emphasis is really on how the contractors are now working, given the constraints that they have.
Mm-hmm.
They have less resources, so they need to focus more on how to let these resources work in a smarter way.
Yeah. So,
Right.
is there? Do they have challenges now actually getting contractors? So, I'm thinking that the macro economy is that there's less construction happening from a corporate real estate perspective, but then is there also less providers in the market, because some of those providers in the market, the employees there, or whether they're self-employed contractors, have gone and found something else to do to fill the gap. So it actually means you've got less suppliers. Is that happening as well?
Yes. So you probably have your big name construction companies out there, but their sub trades, the people that they do business with on a regular basis, their resources are the ones that are being reduced, right? So the big construction companies, they still will have an accounts receivable team. They'll still have a project management team. They'll still have their direct employees. However, on the sub-trade level, that's where you see things changing, right?
Now, do you get in, or can you get insight into that? Or do your suppliers kind of protect their tier 2 and their tier 3 and how they manage that? And for you, it's about, I'm buying these deliverables, and as long as the deliverables are hit, like how involved do you get in that, the kind of low, as you go further down the supply chain, as it were, in construction?
Yeah, it all goes back to that model that we talked about, right? There is that construction management model, and then there's that design build model. When you're in that construction management model, as the owner of that project, you're given more of an opportunity to actually meet with those sub-trades, right? And ask those types of questions. What types of resources am I going to get? What is your plan for when we start transitioning the project to a closeout? Will I lose the team that's with me because you're going to bring in a transition team? So you really get to ask those questions in that model. When we talk about design build, you're not as involved in that selection process of the sub-trade. So you do lose out on getting that insight.
You mentioned earlier about technology, and that technology is starting to become more impactful or more used kind of in the construction procurement space. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how technology is being used in this space and what kind of impact that you're seeing that have.
Sure. You're starting to see more usage of robotics, right? So where we actually had actual human beings digging into the foundation, operating the machines, those machines are now becoming more autonomous. So that's pretty big. And then also just on the management of the projects themselves, where typically, I remember when I started out in the industry and the bid process, when it came to real estate projects, we used to get envelopes that were, 2 or 3 inches thick, proposals from each supplier. And I have to say, in the last decade or so, we've moved away from that and are now embracing a lot more of the procurement systems, right? It could be those regular procurement systems that we all know and love, or it could be a procurement system that is geared towards more of construction itself. Right? But you see changes happening in both ways.
And so as I'm kind of thinking about anybody who's listening who is new to construction procurement, because I imagine it's one of those categories where for a lot of companies, they don't build very often. And so there isn't necessarily the demand to have a subject matter expert on staff all the time who's a construction expert, except for some of the larger companies who are doing a lot of construction, they're doing it all the time. So for a smaller company where there isn't necessarily a construction procurement expert, but there's somebody who is a generalist who has been asked to support a project in construction, like how would you recommend that they start to think about even going about that, and like any tips that you would give to somebody who is new to construction procurement and they're getting involved in a project for the first time?
I would say align yourself to your real estate stakeholders as much as possible. They are definitely the experts in their industry. You could do a lot of reading out there of how to get involved in more construction procurement, thanks to all the literature, thanks to the LinkedIn articles, the construction articles, podcasts. They're a wealth of information. So reading, talking, really understanding where the stakeholder is coming from and what is driving them to get the project done on time. Even talking to vendors. Our vendors are more than happy to talk to us about what they see in the market. There are particular architects out there that they're happy to have you join their newsletters, and you get those monthly newsletters and you get a better understanding of what's driving change within the industry itself.
And when you mentioned architects there, I know we've talked a little bit about the different elements of construction procurement, but what are the main buckets, if you will, of or subcategories of suppliers within this space that you would typically, as somebody who's coming new to this, would may expect to be talking to or to be having to learn a bit more about?
Well, the two top ones are going to be the architects themselves and the engineering firm that you're going to be working with. Those are the top two. Then, depending on the size of the project, you could be engaging so many different types of consultants, right? Because sometimes these consultants will fall under the architect, or sometimes you just think that the spend is so big that it makes more sense for us to have our own direct relationship with them. So you could think about lighting consultants, structural engineering consultants, security consultants, the whole gamut, right? I worked on a project once where you needed to bring a cafe consultant in.
Wow. Yeah. And so whose job then is it to bring all those people together?
The owner and the project manager.
Yeah. There's a lot of coordination between all those different elements. And is there, is it typically a similar approach that you would take to sourcing an architect firm than you would take to sourcing an engineering firm, for example? So kind of typical procurement process, or are there nuances between the two of those?
You know, they're all professional services at the end, right? The one differentiating factor is going to be that construction manager, that general contractor agreement, right? That is not going to be similar to a professional services agreement, right? So you're definitely going to want to talk to architects and engineers about their daily rate, hourly rate, how they're going to approach a project, things like that. Those standard consulting type questions and price models would apply to them.
Yeah. So would you typically source on a fixed cost basis, or is it more of a variable, so hourly based, let's say, with those kind of firms?
I would say it's a hybrid, right? Yeah. Because you never know what kind of changes are going to come up as you go through a project itself, right? I've been involved in projects where we have the fixed, right? But then you have that hourly rate just because midway there's a change and we need to account for that.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to thank you so much for giving us a little bit of a primer on construction procurement. So this is kind of new to me as well. So, if I was asking some basic questions, I apologize, but hopefully that's helpful as well for anybody else who may be coming into construction procurement or has been tasked with a project around construction. I kind of always finish on what I say is the easy question. And that is, if anybody who's listening today would like to reach out, connect with you, where would be the best place for them to find you?
That would be LinkedIn.
Yeah. Well, what I'll do is I'll include a link to your LinkedIn profile on the show notes page for today's episode. So all those are going to be artofprocurement.com/podcast. You'll just be able to search and find our conversation on construction procurement in that podcast page. There'll be a link to Neha's LinkedIn profile to be able to connect directly right there. So I want to thank you again one last time, Neha, for joining us today and for sharing some of your experience within the construction procurement space.
Thank you, Phil. This was a lovely conversation, and I'm glad I could educate you a little bit more on the world of construction procurement.
Thank you very much. If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.